In this lecture, we're going to look at a development called progressive education, and this started roughly about the same time as the progressive period, and so that's why the name is the same, because progressive education took its name from the progressive period. And so roughly we're going to look at about the 1890s to about 1930. So the questions we'll be addressing in this lecture is: what was progressive education? What sparked the progressive education movement? And what were the results of that movement? We have a lot of events on the timeline here, and some of these correspond to progressive institutions like Hull House, which founded in Chicago in 1889, one of the earliest of the settlement house movements, and this was to provide a home where settlement workers would come into inner cities and try to alleviate some of the problems that immigrants and some of those people living in the downtown areas would have faced, and in ethnic communities as well. You also have the Robert E. Lee Monument going up in 1890. This brings up another idea that was popular at the time, and that was the idea of monuments and commemorating the Civil War dead, and especially from this side, the Confederate side. You also have a look at some of the racial issues going on here, and you can always come back and look at this slide or look at the lectures later on. We look at progressivism itself and wonder, what was it? Well, it was a way of expanding democracy. You had all these changes going on. You had new immigrants coming into the United States. You had a rise of industrialism that was providing jobs for many of these new immigrants. You had businesses expanding and new types of business organizations, the trusts, the pools. And you also had, in addition to that, wars going on. So you have the Civil War, which ended, we mentioned that earlier, but also in 1898 you have the beginnings of the Spanish-American War, the annexation of Hawaii, the acquisition of the Philippines and Puerto Rico and other countries. So what do you do about these new groups coming in? Native Americans were also in decline during this period. So there's a lot going on. Native Americans, I say they're in decline. There is the end of the Plains Indian Wars. So a lot was going on during this period. Americans were trying to adapt and to adjust to this new economy, new business, new ethnic groups in the country. Many more Asians were coming in. You had the beginnings in the 1900s of the Mexican Revolution, where they're going to send more immigrants in. So all of these things were affecting society. So they were trying to figure out, how do you expand democracy? How do you get more people to vote? How do you get representation for many of these new types of people coming in? One of the things they didn't like were the trusts. The trusts were seen as anti-democratic. They were hurting small business and giving big business an unfair advantage. There was also an idea that they wanted to reform society, not just because of the new things that were happening, but because they saw a lot of old corruption. They felt that a lot of the immigrants were prey to political bosses who took advantage of them for their votes. They wanted to change that. They wanted to change the way everyday business did work. They wanted to make it more efficient. And they certainly did want better government. So how do you get a better government? The hurricane in Galveston ushered in a new form of government called the commission form of government. And so the Galveston plan, it was known as this commission form of government, where you had people who were trained in specific areas leading those areas. So you had a police commissioner, somebody who was experienced with the police, not just political appointments, running things. And this is going to help lead into this efficiency and scientific management. As businesses were growing, they were trying to look at doing things most cost effectively, the most time-saving manner. And so Frederick Winslow Taylor came in and studied this, and he began putting a book out and other studies out on how to make business more efficient. So this cult of efficiency, as it's sometimes called, scientific management, rose during this period. You also had differences between the rural areas, of course, and urban areas, and these became more pronounced and more noticed, and people were trying to alleviate some of the problems in those rural areas, which are generally poorer than the urban areas. You simply cannot mention progressive education without acknowledging the father of progressive education, and that was John Dewey. Dewey lived for a long time. He lived into his 90s, and he was active. He was writing and he was informing educational reform even until the very end. Now, he was not an educator himself. He was a professor of philosophy, and in Chicago, while he was professor there, he worked closely with Jane Addams and Hull House. So he's influenced by the progressive idea of the settlement house movement. He's influenced by this idea of change in people and change in society. And this is all translated in his philosophy of education. He wrote a couple of books around this time, School and Society being the most popular, and Child and the Curriculum, where he really envisions new ways of education dealing with the changes going on in society and how children are affected by those changes. His influence and his thoughts had a significant effect on changing American schooling. When we look at some of the things that educational progressives were in favor of, they wanted curricular reform. They wanted 12 grades of school. Now, you think today that is commonplace, but in those days it wasn't. Many times children were needed in the fields in rural areas, and so they didn't get much beyond a 6th grade education. A lot of times parents, even in urban areas, were pulling children out of school in order to go to work. So this idea of a kindergarten through 12th grade really gets started during the progressive era, and legislation and policies began to be structured in order to affect that. Rural and urban equality, I mentioned that before. You start to see the idea that urban schools, city schools with bigger tax bases, teachers are paid better, classrooms are better equipped than they are in rural areas, and where you still have a lot of one-room schools and 1 or 2 teachers teaching 30 or 40 students in a variety of grades, all kind of crammed together in a classroom. There was also ideas of professionalization and the certification of teachers. In a lot of these rural schools, they didn't have enough money to attract teachers, so a lot of teachers were not what we would call certified, or some of them had 1 or 2 year certifications because they hadn't completed schools themselves. So this idea of professionalization, improving teachers' salary, and in turn also making sure that teachers are better trained. I mentioned the efficiency movement. Efficiency in school management was important. How do you cut costs on public education? So this idea of centralizing, if you had a lot of these one-room schools, those were really inefficient, and they were scattered and they were spread out, and so there was no real way of controlling the costs. And so school curriculum experts were looking at ways, and school administration experts were looking at ways of controlling the costs. This idea of school testing, this actually comes out of a wartime, World War I way of assigning troops, assigning soldiers to various capacities is by testing them, and then it's and what we would call intelligence testing. And it kind of blends into kind of the scientific racism of the period, the social Darwinism of the period, which said that certain groups of people were better adapted at certain things than others, certain ethnic groups. And so there's a lot of racism, subtle racism that plays into this. Part of the reason for these reforms was what was going on after World War I. You saw a lot of wartime draftees get rejected because they were not fit, they were not healthy. So we needed a strong military. We saw after the Spanish-American War and World War I, and education seemed a good way of achieving that. There were compulsory attendance laws. A lot of children, especially from immigrant families, were working in factories, or you had a lot of poor orphans who were working in factories. Well, that couldn't stand, and so you needed to pull the children outside of the factories and into the schools. There were also ideas like free textbooks and the idea of free school transportation, there's buses to get children to schools. And Also, one of the things we have to look at is how they were educating minorities. One thing that stands out is this reform of Native American education. The Merriam Report in 1928 really called into question the use of Indian boarding schools and kind of chastised them, and rightly so, for their attempts to eradicate Native American culture. So those are some of educational progressive goals, and there's many others. Another aspect of the progressive period was there were organizations. A lot of organizations came up, but the idea too that parents needed to be involved in education. Of course, that it seems silly that this was a new idea, but this National Congress of Parents and Teachers, which started off as the National Congress of Mothers and later on becomes the Parent Teacher Association, the PTA. This idea of parents needing to work with the schools was very popular and has lasted many, many years. You also had progressive organizations themselves. Now, one that I have listed here, the Country Life Movement. I mentioned earlier that there were these ideas of differences between the rural areas and the agricultural areas and the urban areas. The idea was that as more people were moving into the cities, and in the United States, people began as a result of agricultural technological improvements, you see less need for people on the farms. More people start moving into the cities, and there was this idea that we needed to keep people on the farms. We needed to make sure we had people working in agriculture. So we needed to improve, therefore, it was thought, agricultural life. So the Country Life movement started, and it lasted about 20 years. It was this attempt to improve life in the countrysides. This idea of kind of a Jeffersonian romantic idea of the country, to get people to move back to the country, to stay on the country. And one of the goals was to provide better education to rural schools. You also had a lot of other progressives just in general. In fact, one historian of the progressive era has kind of said, if everybody's progressive, is it unique? You had Republicans, you had Democrats, you had conservatives, you had liberals. You had all of these groups who all wanted to consider themselves progressive. And you do have organizations. The Progressive Education Association, very important during this period. And the development of youth organizations themselves, like the Boy Scouts, for example, gets started and spreads across the United States to organize young people. You also have other types of associations like this as well. In the idea of curricular reform, one group that stands out is the Committee of 10. They wanted to see how public education should be structured, and this is where that idea of 12 years of schooling developed, and that all students should receive the same course of instruction. So they were against tracking. They said, everybody, doesn't matter where you're going to be working after school, you needed to have some basic instruction and some exposure to the classics, maybe not so much on the classical languages. And in fact, there were pathways you could choose not to focus on Greek and Latin, but to do a little bit more practical instruction, but instruction that would get you through life. And they also emphasized the need for better teacher training. On the other hand, you have another group, the National Society for the Promotion of Industrial Education, whose focus is having high school teach technical and trade skills that people would use in this age when industry was on the rise and when you see new developments and new technology. One thing that is kind of a shadow across the progressive movement was the idea of racial segregation. And it was during this period, in the 1890s, that segregation actually became legal. There was a Supreme Court decision in 1896 out of a Louisiana case called Plessy versus Ferguson. And in this case, the rule that kind of became entrenched throughout American history was this idea of separate but equal, that as long as you had accommodations for African Americans or other minorities, and as long as it was equal, it was okay to segregate. Of course, in reality, they were always separate train cars, separate bus seats, separate schools, but they were very rarely equal. In response to some of the segregation, you do see the development of school philanthropic organizations. Now, you have the General Education Board, and this comes out of Rockefeller money. The General Education Board directed its attention to improving schools, especially in the South. They were looking at schools everywhere, but they really kind of focused on the South. You also see new organizations like the Anna T. Jeanes Foundation. And Anna T. Jeanes, a Quaker philanthropist in the North, who wanted to help Southern blacks. And so shortly before she died, she established this fund, and it was specifically for African American education. Then you also had the realization that even the parent-teacher organizations were segregated. So you had the National Congress of Parents and Teachers, and then a separate organization for African American teachers and parents called the National Congress of Colored Parents and Teachers. Now, the interesting thing that I put in here is the date. You understand that it starts in the 1920s, it was a segregated period, but this remains a separate organization even after segregation has been declared illegal, up until 1970, when it finally merges with the National Congress of Parents and Teachers and forms its, they join organizations. But that it lasted so long, I think, is rather interesting. For immigration, with all these new ethnic groups coming in or increasing enrollment, led to an enrollment in schools. And not just that, but just the idea. It wasn't just the immigrants that were helping to increase enrollment in schools, although they contributed quite a bit, but just the idea that education was important and we needed to develop more emphasis on education. Many people started enrolling more and more children in schools. And the idea, too, was to help take these immigrant children and even rural children and kind of teach them a common culture. And we've looked at that in the past in other lectures, this idea of the commonism. But this was really important during this period of high immigration, this idea of assimilation. And actually the Ku Klux Klan was very interested in education in the 1920s, and they lent a lot of support, ironically enough. You wouldn't think this, but they were very supportive of education as long as it taught Americanism. Another aspect is the development following World War I of English-only laws. Many schools and communities taught in their own languages, in whatever, Czech, Polish, Swedish, other languages, German especially. Following World War I, there was an effort to get rid of German out of the schools. And so these English-only laws were really directed at forbidding the promotion of German in the schools. But it applied to other languages as well. And you still see the segregation that we were talking about earlier, segregation not only of African American children, but also the beginnings of segregation of other minority groups. And whether you're talking about Asians in California, Native American children, there was a lot of segregation. In 1902, for the first time in Texas history that we know of, we found school board minutes in Seguin, Texas, just east of San Antonio, where a school district ordered in 1902 the segregation of Mexican American children. So this was not by law, it was by practice. And so you do see that segregation is going on for a lot of groups in the United States. You also had Catholic education. And the Catholic education, we've talked about this in previous lectures, but it really steps up with these organizations. And again, this is the period of associations and organizations. So you have the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities, the Catholic Educational Association, and these are trying to kind of consolidate and provide direction to Catholic colleges and also parochial schools for younger children. Another kind of dark side of the period was that in the 1870s, 1875, you have the Blaine Amendments. The Blaine Amendments prohibited funds for Catholic schools, so they wouldn't allow public funds to be used for parochial schools, and this was copied in several states. Finally, in 1925, a Supreme Court decision, Pierce versus Society of Sisters, said this was unconstitutional and that public funds could be used for religious-based schools. So this kind of brings us into this other idea that was very popular at the time, and this was the idea of fundamentalism, that what was in the Bible was 100% true. And this received a lot of support from the Ku Klux Klan, who was very interested in morality at the time, and in this religious ideology. And the target of a lot of the fundamentalism as far as schools were concerned was the teaching of evolution. So in Dayton, Tennessee, as one of these laws was passed in the state to prohibit the teaching of evolution, there was a test case brought before the courts. A biology teacher in this Tennessee town taught evolution, and he was arrested for it, and the trial happened. I have two pictures here of two men. On the left, on the right-hand side is William Jennings Bryan. Bryan had been a progressive and had run about 6 times for president of the United States. On the left-hand side is Clarence Darrow. Clarence Darrow was a very well-known and respected criminal lawyer. And he came down and volunteered to represent Scopes, the teacher, while William Jennings Bryan, the politician, came in to prosecute Scopes. Now, William Jennings Bryan was also the author of the legislation that had been written, and several states had copied his legislation. So in a sense, he saw it as a defense of this law that he had written and that had other states had adopted. This became a media circus. The national news descended. Newspapers, magazine reporters descended on this small little Tennessee town, and this became a cause célèbre. In the end, Scopes was convicted, but Darrow kind of made a fool out of Bryan, and Bryan, who was in poor health anyway, diabetic, and just not doing well, died a few days later after the trial was over. So, but this idea of evolution in the schools and what you could and could not teach in the school kind of got a lot of attention during this period. So, if we sum up what was progressive education, we can say that it was a grassroots and professional effort from many sides to kind of adapt public schooling to the changing society of the late 1800s, early 1900s, affected by industrialism, immigration, the Spanish-American War, and World War I. So all of these things were changing and affecting society. How do schools adapt? And that's what progressive education was trying to address. What sparked the progressive movement? Well, it was all of those things. It was a response to the changing American society affected by war, by immigration, by industrialization, and the new 20th century, right? The idea that it was a new century also meant something to people. And what were the results of the progressive education movement? Well, there were new concepts of what children could do, how they learned, and how they should be taught. So you see this in Dewey and others, a more child-centered education rather than this idea of rote memorization. Ideas that had been going around for a while of adapting the children to society and making them contributors to society, and how do you instill that idea of Americanization, how do you instill these ideas of citizenship into young people, and what were they capable of doing with that? One of the other things you have to realize is that progressive education, and not just the movement, but the period itself, this idea of the importance of schools did lead to greater graduation and the expectation that people had to graduate from high school. And so if we look at this, only 3.5% of the population of the United States had graduated from high school in 1890. So if you graduated from high school, that was pretty rare. But look, By 1920, with just in a few years, you already have increased that by almost 5. So you almost have 17% of the population graduating with a high school degree. Now, you may say, well, that's not a lot, and in fact, it still isn't, but the idea is that high school became more important, and the idea is of finishing school became more important. And that was some of the results of the progressive education movement. Thank you very much for your time. In the next lecture, we're going to look at how the Great Depression and World War II changed public schools.